Hello and welcome to our first series of 2025. At the close of 2024, we hinted at the mindset of feeding on Jesus, a phrase which you may have heard in church settings before, or that you may have heard me mention in the past. Now, this phrasing can mean different things to people depending on their upbringing or prior exposure to theologies, but the idea carries a very specific meaning in the scripture. And as we saw previously, feeding on Jesus is a vivid picture portrayed in the scriptures in several different ways. So throughout this series, we will look at these examples and explore what feeding on Jesus actually means, not based on a man's opinion or their prior experience, but based solely on the pictures and the ideas presented in the scriptures. And we're going to include what these applications mean and look like in daily life. So I hope you're ready. This is going to be a big series, and I hope it benefits you as much as it does me. Let's get started. Welcome to Thriving Branch. I'm Jim. The concept of feeding on Jesus is not a modern invention. It actually began with Jesus himself. And so, for an intro to the story today, we're going to be taking a look at a parable told by Jesus, found in Luke chapter 14, verses 16 through 24. And in this scripture, we see Jesus telling a parable about a large banquet. So let's read the story together. Luke chapter 14, verses 16 through 24. Ready? 1, 2, and let's read. Then said he to him, a certain man made a great supper, and bade many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray you have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray you have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So that servant came and showed his lord these things. And then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor, and the maimed, and the halt, and the blind. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as you have commanded, and yet there is room. And the Lord said to the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. Now there are several points to consider here. We see that a man gave a great banquet, and he invited many people. Now what's interesting, though, are the responses of the invitees. In verse 18, we see that all of those invited began to make excuse as to why they couldn't come. This is unusual for several reasons. First, we see from the previous verse, 17, that they were called to come at supper time. This was not some strange hour. But even more than that, in verse 16, we can see that they were invited. They knew what was going on, and they were expected to come, and they knew that. They knew what time it was going to be. I'm sure the invitation included the time. So even if all of their reasons for not showing up were completely true, they would have known not to schedule things at the time of the invitation. So that's odd. Another intriguing point is that their excuses don't make much sense. The first invitee says, I bought a piece of land and I must go and see it. The second invitee says, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to prove or to test them. Now, I ask you, who in their right mind would buy these things before inspecting them? Who would buy a field without ever seeing it? It might be filled with waste. It might be a bad piece of land. Who buys it before you see it? The same thing with oxen. Who buys 5 yoke of oxen without ever seeing them? They could all be sickly. They could be maimed. That's the equivalent of someone going out today buying a car before test driving it. That's not normal. So that's odd too. Another curious detail is that in verse 18, it mentions that they began to give excuse all with one consent, which seems to suggest this was all part of some plan or scheme to avoid this banquet. Isn't that strange? Who doesn't enjoy free food? Who goes to such lengths to avoid getting free food? Even if they didn't really care for the master or the other guests, the typical thing to do would be to go, eat your food, and then leave, right? So all of these things are very strange. The story itself really doesn't make much sense until we consider the spiritual parallels. You might already be beginning to realize this isn't so much about a physical feast, but it's about Jesus, the feast of eternity. As I mentioned at the start, the idea of Jesus being the ultimate spiritual feast is actually nothing new. Jesus himself taught this idea in various ways. He's teaching it here now. But for other examples, we have John chapter 6, verse 35. Jesus says that he is the bread of life. And he that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. Again, in John chapter 6, verse 51, Jesus says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Notice here that Jesus says he is the living bread that came down from heaven, and that whoever eats of Jesus' bread, which is his flesh that he gives, will live forever. So this is a fairly clear picture of Jesus' sacrificial atonement. His flesh was marred on that cross. His flesh was beaten and bruised and torn. And the redemption that comes from that, the redemption that comes from receiving that, is what's really in focus here. Now let's return to Jesus' parable of the banquet feast and examine it some more in the light of this new perspective. The people who were invited with one consent began to make excuse, very similarly to how the Pharisees were in agreement to refuse and reject Jesus. For example, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 14. But still we must ask why this is so. Why were they making all of these excuses to get out of the banquet? Again, even if they didn't care much for the host or the other guests, most people would attend even for a short while just for the chance at some free food. So this only leaves two likely options. Either they didn't value the food itself, or they saw the banquet as truly unimportant. And this gets to the heart of the issue. There are those who value other things, even their own self-effort above that of Jesus. There are those who would rather sacrifice themselves rather than accept the sacrifice of Jesus. And likewise, there are those who see Jesus as an entirely uninteresting and unimportant thing. Just not important. If I have some extra time, maybe I'll look at Jesus a little bit here and there, in between my own serving, in between my own doing this or that. Maybe I'll get around to Jesus. There are those on both sides of that fence. But as we continue throughout this series, the goal is for us, as we're looking at all of these details, the goal for us is to truly savor Jesus, to go deep into his finished work, to see all the details that he put there in these writings. This will not be a speed run, just so you know. And we'll be taking our time to thoroughly meditate on several key aspects. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction, because that's all this was. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction, and I look forward to thriving with you again in 2025. Be blessed.